Well, hello. Welcome to the next episode of Totally Rewarding Chats. I'm here, Paul Reiman from Novo Insights. Sean Luitjens, our normal co-host. Say hello.
Hello. I see. Look at me. I'm following directions, Paul. This is the first time I'm not leaving anything else. You just tell me when to speak.
I do that in my life. I have two small children and a wife, and I'm normally the one waiting to speak. So I'm glad I'm glad to be in charge here. And we are super stoked to be joined today by Tammi Markovich. Say hi, Tammi. Hi, Tammi.
Hello, hello. Glad to be here.
Yeah, thanks for joining. I'm sure you're looking forward to listening to yourself on one of your commutes to Michigan or to Detroit at some point in the future. But so others can get to know you, why don't you start with introducing yourself? Tell us a little bit about you, your role, and so we can get to know you a bit.
Absolutely. So, Tammi Markovich, and I have been in the HR space now for about 20 years, and most of that in the compensation world. As you can imagine, that wasn't really what I started off in college. I don't think anybody says
Nobody.
No, nobody says in college, hey, I'm going to go be a comp expert. But that's just kind of how life took me where I am today. I actually started off in accounting and finance. Worked in finance first and then accounting, which is also kind of backwards. And then there was an opportunity to jump over into HR where I led total rewards in the HR space. And then after that was really, I've been in the public sectors, the publicly traded industry since, so mostly in manufacturing. So yeah, it's been exciting. Do a lot with, executive compensation, broad-based compensation, and currently I work at Masco Corporation, which is out of Livonia, Michigan, which just outside of Detroit. As Paul mentioned, I actually live in the Grand Rapids area, so I make my jaunt over on the east side of the state now and again, and we were just talking about listening to podcasts on our journey to do that, and how return to work has enabled some people to get back into the podcast exercise, I guess you can say.
That's right.
Where for those of us who've been working at home, we kind of miss out on that.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
So they need you in the RTO marketing department because you now have this unique opportunity to get educated during the thing. That's the spin, right? Is the positive spin. Out of that whole bio, the one thing I'm curious about, when you made the jump from accounting to HR, you said the opportunity. You say that now, and I believe that. At the time, I'm curious. At the time, did you say, you know what, that would be cool?
Yeah, it's funny. So at the company that I was at, both finance and accounting reported to the CFO as well as HR. So it was kind of a unique situation where I had the CFO in my corner, whether I stayed in accounting and finance or whether I went into HR. And I sat down with her. I'm like, hey, this is an opportunity for me. I kind of like the idea of being able to use my numbers, knowledge, and comfort with numbers in the HR space. And she was really like, I don't know, I really want to see you as a controller. And I'm thinking, I'm never going to be a controller. That's not where my life really, I can see myself. So she supported me going over into the HR space. And the HR leader there was like, hey, I know who you are. I've worked with you from, the connection between accounting and HR. I can teach you HR. So, it was someone that took a chance on me, and here I am.
Yeah.
20 years later.
Yeah. Now,
that's great. It's amazing how many cool stories start that way with people being like, and we'll get to the speed round, Paul, but the interesting concept of sometimes talking about in TA, do you hire for aptitude and attitude over experience and current skills?
Absolutely.
And so, here's a cool, success story around, got the right attitude and aptitude, and I can teach you the rest. It's all good.
Yeah. I'm also, look, nobody chooses compensation. Compensation chooses you. So sometimes it's just a natural sort of fate finds its way to get the right people in, because nobody grows up. It's the loneliest table at the elementary school career day is the comp analyst, right?
Yeah, I agree. You try to make it as exciting as possible, but I have two teenage daughters, and neither one of them were like, yeah, I'm not doing HR.
Yeah, exactly. People ask me that a lot. Which kid's going to take over your business? I'm like, I don't think either have any interest in doing what I do.
No,
so did you put a sign outside with two teenage daughters that you're recording a podcast to keep them quiet and everything? Because you might find that might be a solid thing to just leave out there.
Maybe that's a great idea. So I'm actually hoping that because the one's in college, so sophomore at University of Cincinnati, so go Bearcats. And the youngest one is still in high school, and yes, so should come barreling through here. I'm hoping after our podcast is done.
Well,
We'll
you can
see.
tell her if she does, you can turn around and say, between Paul and Sean, you have about 15 seconds to exit before you're TikTokable and not in a good way.
Oh,
So,
I trust me, when I said I was doing the podcast, I described it to them as I am now an influencer. So
Ooh, that's a language they speak, right?
that is a language they speak. They both
you
rolled their
go.
eyes at me, but whatever, I don't
I
care.
mean, resume bullet point right there. You are now a total rewards influencer.
Yep.
I love it. Well, we know each other from the World at Work Advisory Council. That's sort of where we sort of first got connected. So our speed round is going to be, there's like one little work thing, but other than that, it's really more about you. So it's personal preferences. Like what are you, a this or that style. We'll give you two choices. You pick the one. I'll start with the work one. Are you a compa ratio or a position and range person?
Ratio, science, numbers. That's where I live.
Position and range is numbers too.
I know. I just think, the thing is, I'll just leave it. This is the speed round, Tammy. No one outside of, now you're truly a comp person because you can't talk to normal humans in the term comp ratio. That's I'm okay with it one-on-one, but I think it's not hard to communicate. But it's interesting how many people really like that.
There's some strong opinions in this.
Strong
space,
opinions.
that's for sure.
Yeah, I didn't think it was that big when we started that question. Actually, I thought it'd be like, I don't care. That's not generally the answer.
Yeah. Now I'll say the storytelling needs to be different than compa ratio, right? So compa ratio
Exactly.
helps us to decide what story to tell, but talking compa ratio to the employees is not going to be helpful either.
That's exactly. I'm 100% there. That's why I'm more of an it depends guy. But I'm with you. Coffee or tea?
Coffee.
Like all day. We've talked to a lot of people who flip. They start coffee and then flip. But you're like a
Yeah,
all-in coffee?
to that point, I had iced tea yesterday. So, yeah. It's
on my
coffee
desk right
every
now.
day. Yeah, exactly. I like that one. It's coffee every morning, get my day started. Iced coffee in the afternoon if I need an extra treat. And then, hot tea in the winter when it's really cold.
So you're a
Especially like the
beverage-free
cinnamon
agent,
one.
basically.
I am a
Yeah.
beverage-free agent. You're
Yeah,
right. You're
okay.
right. Coffee consistent, tea when I feel like it.
Yeah,
Okay.
that's good. That's fine. This is the one that tells you if you're on Team Sean or Team Paul. So you've got a free weekend coming up. Is that going to be spent sort of in the woods in your camper in a tent or at a nice seaside beachy hotel?
Okay, so weekend event would be camping.
Ooh, we have a Team Sean.
All right, Paul.
Team
Paul.
Sean.
You've stopped a long run of posh lovers. So
I
I'm
do
very,
love
very
my
glad to have
beach.
you here.
But I want a beach longer than a weekend. But if I can do
Oh,
a quick
okay, there we
weekend
go.
getaway,
No more talking. Don't talk on this anymore, Tammy. I'm taking the W. Yeah.
take the W. Because I own a camper, right? So that automatically puts me in your boat. So yes,
All right.
we love going camping. We live in Michigan, right? So there's so much beautiful area to go camping in.
I actually made that comment to my brother-in-law this weekend. I was talking about my week. I'm like, I'm actually doing an interview with somebody who's on this podcast from Michigan. I'm like, if there's anybody who's going to break the string of posh stays, it's going to be a Michigander, right? Because there's just so much good outdoors to explore.
It's a beautiful, beautiful place. Yep.
Yeah, makes perfect sense. All right, well, I'll get over that. Crunchy or creamy peanut butter?
Creamy. Can't do the crunchy.
All right, that's fine. And then the special one for you, because it's going to parlay into our discussion, are you a night owl or a morning person?
Night owl. Mornings are not meant to be.
I mean, you want there to be a morning, right?
I
If you
want
don't
there to
have
be a morning, but I want it to be without an alarm clock and when I feel like the morning should start.
Yeah. As my son, I have a son who's a night owl, and he said, because I'm a very early riser, he goes, I like you to be up to confirm dawn happened. I just don't want to see it.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Sunrise, sunset, absolute sunset. I don't necessarily need to ever see a sunrise.
Definitely a morning person here. And just this morning, my wife told me, she's like, you are way too much before 9 a.m. Like, all right.
I have similar conversations with my husband of like, I can't talk to you yet. I have not even had a sip of coffee.
Yeah, I believe I was making up songs related to my kids' snack choices before my wife was ready to process that information. Like that was a bit much at 7. Like, all
Yeah, I
right,
can
sorry.
empathize with her.
All right. Well, now we're warmed up. Now we know a little bit more about Tammy. So Masco and in your prior roles as well are global organizations, right? They're big places. So we wanted to dive in a little bit about sort of the uniqueness of working globally. So many of our listeners also work in global companies, or maybe they don't, and they've thought about, what's the right way to do this. So the first thing I guess I wanted to open with is, what's your favorite part about working in these bigger global companies? Like, what are those things that you just love about the fact that your role has this global influence and scope?
I learn every day, right? There's so much that's different from the United States, and not just culturally, but just practices, pay practices, how they approach benefits.
Mm-hmm.
And it just makes you realize that we live in such a little bubble when we think just United States, and really having to be purposeful with that lens of thinking globally. And when you put together materials, like you have to think about, okay, well, how does that impact whatever country, and usually multiple countries? And do we have to think about translations in different languages, and how many languages, and what makes sense for the company? And you just always have to remind yourself when you're thinking, like even scheduling a meeting, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so what's the best time to schedule a meeting that I can get most of the world in their waking hours?
Yeah. I think it's really interesting. I think when you're in a global role, and mostly I've worked at global software companies, is most people have a U.S. centric view, but you realize the U.S. is actually more an anomaly than the norm compared to everybody else in the world. And so your opportunity for learning, if we're going to spin it to the silver lining, I think is huge because they're different, and they're just as complex, but in different ways. And so you really get, how do you put that together? So I think it is cool to hear you say that. And of course, then, an American company doing it global versus a global company coming to the U.S. is two different things.
Mm.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's, again, like you have to think about the people that you're going to be influencing. There's always quirks that I don't even think about. Like, you try and pay attention to the work councils, and you try and pay attention to how India does their pay calculation, right? And then you have Mexico that all of a sudden put a spin on another requirement that you have to think about for, right? It's like, holy cow, I can't, how do I keep up with everything? So, yeah, I love that part about my job. It's always learning. It's always interacting with people with different cultures. So I feel like I have an opportunity to just be a better person by all the education that I get.
I always loved how local global really becomes, right? So, I'll pick on China just because Tammy, you and I had a conversation about China not long ago. Like, China's a big country, right? And from the U.S., sometimes it can feel like one thing, but it's not. Like, there's many quite diverse and varying circumstance of cities and, educational distributions, and like, it's just as complex, if not more complex, than the U.S. So we oversimplify to a country sometimes, but
Europe,
really,
I think, Paul.
oh my
Europe,
gosh, yeah.
I like to jokingly remind people, as an American, I do know that Europe is not one country.
Right.
That a lot of people will say that, like, hey, we have this thing for Europe, and you're like, how often have you worked in Europe? Because each one of them is their own thing, right? And super complex. And yeah, that's a great example, Paul, China, because China, people just forget how many cities are bigger or the same size as New York City there, and then how remote is in China, and it's a crazy place to figure out.
Totally. Or even like UK, as just because I had a recent example of this, like London's big within the UK, but for manufacture, and I actually don't know if you have locations there, Tammy, but like the manufacturing isn't always in London. And if you're in, outwards in the country, like, how do you even get data for that? Like, it's a whole unique challenge compared to, we know how to do that and think about that in the US, but is there data for Loughborough, UK? Like, that's harder to find than.
And the answer is no, there really isn't, right? You have London and you have everywhere else, and you kind of just put the premium on London and
hope for the best.
You get it right.
That's right. Yeah. So let's flip it then. So, like, other than just the obvious, like, what are the hardest parts then of working globally? What are some of the unique challenges you've experienced that are like you love it, you learn all the advantages described. Here's what you have to sort of manage in that process. So what are some of the hardest parts?
For me, it's not as simple as language barrier, because many of the people that I talk to are very fluent in English. So it isn't the English to whatever language barrier, it's the interpretation of the words that is a struggle. So, for example, we have at Masco, we have a very large subsidiary that sits, or a business unit, I don't want to make them mad, a business unit that sits in Germany. And we spend a lot of time talking through compensation, and we just had to go through this exercise of the bonus programs and how they define who's in the bonus program versus how I define who is in the bonus program. You can't articulate that in an email. Like, you have to have the conversation with them about, okay, when you say management board, right? Because again, they use different language. Like, they have a board that's their C-suite. They don't call it C-suite, they call it board. And those are a unique group. And then there's the people below that, but they have different definitions than what I have as a definition. So it's pick up the phone and have the conversation with them. You just can't catch the meanings when you're doing emails.
I used to liken it to the first meeting when I was in mobility, and you're talking to people across the world, that you have to have the kindergarten meeting where you match the boxes on both sides. And so you're like, what do you call the person that's leading, the managing director there? What is that here? Because we don't have, that's the one that I always use as examples. Like, we don't have managing directors here. If you said, hey, Paul's the managing director of Novo, they'll be like, what is he doing? Right. And so that to me, I agree 100%, because then the amount of time that gets wasted, if you don't have this kind of, for lack of a better term, a remedial meeting to be like, are we speaking literally the same language? I like the way you put it. It's almost like another language that you have to make sure that you have the translation in place for, so that you can then productively sit down and really be talking about the same thing.
Right, because we're presenting this to whomever, right? So if it's a leadership team, it's the board, like whoever is being presented this data, it's so important that we're speaking the same language of how we're defining the various levels, so that if questions come back to us, we're not having well, that's not what I said, or you didn't tell me that's how you meant it, right? So we have to get all of that out before we move forward with any sort of presentation or assumptions that are made about the programs that are in place.
Does that take your team? I'm curious, like, it's an ongoing thing. So, what percent do you think it adds to the amount of work you do? So there's the complexity on the math side, but then there's this actually communication piece to management. And I would, argue too, if you have centralized HR somewhere, a core central thing, you have to push it back to employees in a manner they understand as well, or hopefully understand.
Yeah, so it's building that partnership, really. So that's something that I learned early in my career. And it doesn't necessarily matter if it's country or if it's even within the US. It's having those partnerships and building those relationships with the various stakeholders that you work with. So, finance and compensation, finance is your best friend always, right? They talk numbers, or a great team member to just bounce ideas off of. They'll come at you with a different sort of perspective, and you get that internationally too. So I have a rapport already built with my Germany team. So I do have that ability to be like, hey, do you have 10 minutes? And we can talk through, hey, this is what you sent me. I just want to make sure I understand as I present it. This is what I'm looking at. I'll send you what I have. Double check it, make sure it's right? It takes us 15, 20 minutes and we have it done. But to your point, if I didn't already have that relationship, it could take days, right? Well, they don't know who I am, so they're not going to take the time to come talk to me. So it's truly building out those relationships.
Yeah. I, all of my operating roles were global, and I was surprised when I took them, because I didn't really work that globally before then, how much the world expects you, particularly as an American, to be US centric. And to sort of prove to them, like, no, I actually do get that the world doesn't revolve around around us, and I get that it's different. But it took a lot just to convince people that, like, no, I'm serious. Like, I'm not just playing lip service to the fact that I get that Germany's different. It's, I want to understand how is it different? Help me understand what needs to be done. Like it took a long time in every organization to build that trust that I wasn't just, hey, I'm here from America and I'm going to tell you what to do.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. And you have to pause yourself when you're speaking to the international teams, especially for the first couple of times, because right, they catch that dumb American very quickly.
Yes.
So that first impression is key, and you just have to be very conscious of how you want to present yourself and articulate your questions and your getting to know you. I actually had the privilege of my first true global job. Our international headquarters was in the UK, and the HR leader there was of mentor in stage of her life, and I could call her up and be like, okay, I don't want to sound like a dumb American, but how can I say this? And she'd be like, oh, this is so fun, right? And I get off the phone and I'm like, oh, she said I was brilliant, like right. So I had that comfort and a great mentor that let me be dumb in front of them where it was safe, and then would walk me through like where I misstepped and how I can articulate the story better and how I can better relate. And so that was life altering for me.
Whether it's anything else, like from a mentoring or just anywhere else you go, I generally am, so it's probably easier for me. But acting like you're the dumbest person in the room is the way to go. And the words "I don't know," I think not enough people exactly do this and be like, "There's 100 and whatever, 200 countries, however many you're doing business in, like all that." It's okay to be like, "I don't know how they all work. I just got here. Like, help me out. You guys are experts. You know what's going on. Educate me," and then to sit back and listen. And because I don't think enough people do that. They just start going, and like it truly is crazy. I mean, even if you do like the first global thing I did way back at Mercer in benefits, so you can imagine I'm an American and I started a benefits place, and you're like, wait, what? Like I was like, wait, wait, we're not just different, we're like really different, and then every country's different, and like there's so much to do, and so you just sit back and listen to how they operate and how they position things, and it is truly amazing how they've worked the problem in so many different ways.
Yeah, that's what I was managing somebody who was about to do their first global trip back when I was a big firm consultant, and they were convinced that the strategy was they needed to learn how to say hello in the local language. I'm like, no, like you're barking up the wrong tree here, right? Like you're there to learn, not to show that you know them already. Like that's the key. And the advice I still give is, being vulnerable is actually a great strategy in most countries. There are some places where if you come in and say, I don't know, actually that's problematic, but that's not most of the countries we do business in. Like to walk in and say, help me understand is always the best answer, and embrace that, right? Like just own the fact that you aren't the expert yet and let them in-country people be the owner of the expertise. And the faster you can get to that level of trust and understanding, like I'm going to bring some content knowledge, you got to help me localize it. Like that partnership is invaluable. Like that's the secret. And, for sure.
Well, and I think the part on that, Paul, is like just like comp in the U.S. You read about it, right? And you can read about what might be the statutory requirements in the U.K. or might be the statutory requirements in Belgium. Like you can go over there, but we all know the practicality of what happens on the ground and how things actually operationally, functionally get done,
Yep.
With the amount of time they have and resources is not one and the same. And so you can learn way more. It's book smarts versus street smarts. And you've got, they have the street smarts in all those places on how things actually get done.
Yeah. One thing you mentioned on their favorite parts, right? The learning about the different things. You mentioned look, countries are different. They tax things differently. They regulate things differently. Maybe there's a sidetrack we take here on the strategic side of, and how much of that do you think is right to care about, right? I think there's good debates about, why should I care about the tax in a country, right? Like we don't make changes to our reward programs necessarily if the tax rates change. So I guess, it's one thing to learn it, but then how have you thought about applying that globally? Like how do you collaborate to put that localized knowledge into practice? Is it something you just need to understand? Do you actually think you should be changing programs on that? I guess what's your viewpoint on how do you customize given that countries are different?
Yeah, it's like anything else. You need to know enough to be dangerous, right? So you create any new program, you what could you trip on as you're creating the program? And honestly, as you were talking about, one of the first things that I thought of was promotions and paying. I'll say promotions in the UK, right? You're like, they're basically the same as us when it comes to pay increase percentages. So you would think the same with promotional increases until you realize that half of their promotion is consumed in taxes. Right. So if you think about, oh, we're going to do a 3 to 5% increase in the UK, that's great. Well, they really only get half of that. So put that into consideration when you're thinking about how large of a promotion this really is to that person when it comes to, life-changing event of this promotion. So again, the United States were like, oh, anywhere from that 10 to 20,000, like that's a big change in someone's pay. Well, if you divide that in half, like a 10,000 big change in the United States is only a 5,000 not so big change in the UK. So there's things like that you just have to be aware of. It doesn't mean that you change your program, right? 5,000 is 5,000, and obviously I'm translating that all into US dollars, right? But there's things that you just have to be aware of. And to your point, Paul, it doesn't necessarily mean you're going to change your program, but just understand the impact and bring it forward to again, like things that we have to think about when we're working with Germany is the taxation is different. So if we want to change our program, if we want to change how we do our stock program, how does that impact what we want to do from a taxation perspective? And right, so there's all these things that we have to think about that aren't necessarily we're not going to change how we do our program again, right? We just have to make sure that we're paying attention to the true impact of what that means to an employee.
That's right. And I think some of it is you have to get to kind of fact as well. Like, it's different is like a common sort of refrain I hear from a lot of people. But let's be clear about what that means, right? Like, equity is not as valued because the tax. Well, what about the tax, right? Is it just because the rates are high? Like, I get it, but that's a different circumstance than it's actually taxed at grant. Okay, that's a different animal because now I'm cutting a check out of pocket. Right? Like, okay, that's a design thing we need to talk about. Whereas it's just not worth quite as much because that country has a different social tax structure. Like, that's a different. So you got to get to the why. Like, what's the specific thing that's different that makes you really need to debate?
Right. And that's exactly what we would look at. Again, I'm going to pick on stock just because that's something that, you look at annually, right? And you're paying attention to what's happening. Like, were there any regulations that changed in other countries? So that's hard too. You don't always know that, hey, I'm going to, because I keep picking on Germany. Oh, Germany changed their tax law. And now they have to pay taxes at grant, which, by the way, is not what they did. But, right, like, you have to just pay attention to those things that don't always hit your inbox and you don't hear it in the news because it's not within the United States.
Well, that to me, that I think Belgium is right on grant, and that was the first time we talked. I think some if not, someone will message me after this.
You'll be corrected quickly,
and be corrected quickly. But there are countries that do that, right? And so that for me is a good highlight of. Do you start when you think about a global plan? Do you kind of work locally up and kind of look at it and look at the different things and what they want to achieve and take the best? Or do you try to take a global look and push it down and adapt as needed? Because I'm very curious from companies, I've seen both, and I'm curious on your thoughts on that. I don't know that there's a right answer, luckily, but I'm very curious how you all handle that so that they feel they're a part of the process and when they're a part of the process.
Yeah, I think that goes back to the vulnerability of not knowing all the answers, right? So if I'm thinking about a strategic change in the organization around how compensation, whatever program. So we're designing a new program, we're revamping a program. I do set it at the corporate level and then work with the locals. Like, hey, here's what's happening. What requirements do we need for employees, right? So outside the United States, most changes require a new contract or an amendment to a contract. So you need to bring your legal team in. You need to, right, if it's something completely new, like you're going to have to bring external legal in. Right. So those are the things that we have to just be aware of. If you're setting up a program, it isn't going to take a few weeks. It's going to take a few months. So you kind of start thinking about a new program, and as soon as you're completing the end of the year, and it may be that it takes you one cycle, it may actually take you two cycles to get what you want introduced globally.
Yeah. I have had some, well, just some personal experiences I've been involved in where like the strategy is all around flipping to local, right? So it's like, no, we are deliberately trying to build out our, development center in Eastern Europe, right? I'm just going to make that up as an example. Okay, now like you're better off actually building from local up because you're trying to make sure that everything you do resonates strongly in a local market, right? So, to your question, Sean, like there are times where you flip that lens a little bit and be like, no, the problem I am trying to solve is a local problem, in which case I'm going to build from the ground back towards sort of a corporate view. Whereas if it's, here's how we want to think about pay for performance, or here's how we want to drive an ownership mindset, kind of by definition, that's filtering down from a broad enterprise strategy that needs to be localized. So there's a little bit of like the problem tells you kind of which direction you approach it.
You said it's not black and white. There might be black on one side, white at the very end, and there's 99.5% gray. And it's a matter of, to these point, your company. That's why I'm always very perplexed how it works. And I think, why I don't think it's either white or black. I don't know which one's local and which one's global, but why I don't think it happens because you get the feedback and then you have to have some consistency somewhere, or vice versa. You can't push it all the way down what you want to do exactly the way you want to do it because somewhere you just can't legally do that thing, right? So
and Paul, you bring up a great example. Like when you're standing up a new plant, you have to do that local. Right? You need to make sure that you bring in the appropriate resources from a regulatory and compliance and best practice, right? So you're working with, again, some external legal, you're working with external compensation experts that are from the local area to help you stand that up. And then, once it's stood up and you have the right pay programs in place to meet local, and you're considering, okay, are you paying for their housing? Because, in some countries, they come in from rural areas and they live in dorms or housing, and so you're paying for that, right? So that's part of the local experience. And then you're still at the headquarters, you're setting the strategy of how pay programs may operate, and then yes, they're putting in the local spin to make them competitive in whatever market they're in.
Right.
Yeah, and they all end up, I think, with technology and data the way it is, they all start to go back and look. And a company that remained nameless had, somewhere in Australia, and they had people here, and, you obviously have employees going, well, I'd like an extra month of pay. Like, how do I get on that train, right?
Right.
I'm like, that sounds great. I still work 12 months, and I get, like, that's it wasn't our choice. This is how it works. And that's where I think your jobs get really, really hard in global businesses. The communications and how you communicate that, even if it doesn't get out, becomes really difficult. Even just explain to Australian leaders and other country leaders how the math is mathing. Compare.
Yeah, and it's always taking the time to educate your U.S. leaders who may have international employees reporting to them, right? So the first thing they do is translate into U.S. dollars, and they're like, "There's no way we should be paying this little amount for this whiz-bang engineer in whatever country that we're sitting in." And I'm like, well, locally, they actually are doing very well, and we are representing a very high pay for the expertise that they're bringing. They're just not in the United States. If they lived in the United States, you're absolutely right. This would be the dollar amount that we would pay them. But we get to pay local, and so we're going to pay local, not U.S. dollars at the local experience. So just reminding them, and it's across the gamut, right? Like, don't think that this is just a brand new leader. It's a natural, right? You naturally translate, and you just have to help them like, oh yeah, okay, this is right.
Just the simple, FX, the concept of having different exchange rates, great, but the complexity it brings to, year over year comp changes, right?
Yeah,
because, FX changes in Brazil, by 30%. You're like, so the number up or down, they're like, where's all the people? Because we're less, or why are we spending so much? We need to cut. You're like, like for like, it's here. So, and then, you just imagine it by countries. And so, that complexity too, because, everyone always talks about, blue skies, rainbows, and unicorns, global job grades, leveling and matching and comparing globally. And then like just the simple what you pay them in throws a wrench into that right out of the gate.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, the myth of the truly global structure, right?
We've talked about that too.
We had a fun jam on that around how, it is unicorns and rainbows. It sounds great, but the practicality of that is super difficult. And the more countries you're in, the harder or more impossible it becomes. There's no doubt.
Even like just the concept of like buoying on, what it was from last year to last year and picking a date for currency to compare year over year. It's just crap, right? It's just extra stuff that has to happen across it, and you still have to explain it, and it's changed. And that's the part I do think global TR departments, the communication piece becomes even more critical out there. When you compare benefits, why are we paying different? Because American benefits are, amazing compared to everybody else's.
Yes.
And how they work.
And statutory versus best practice, right? So you can come into a country and be like, hey, we're going to statutory benefits and that's what we're going to do. And if you stop there and not necessarily know what practice is, that can be a huge miss.
Yeah. Back to your point of, back to exactly your point of like, tell me how it actually works here, like what works here as opposed to what I read for the statutory.
Yeah.
I also find there's a lot of dogma and not a lot of data sometimes on these things. So cars in Germany, since we're picking on the Germans, right? Like the data doesn't actually support what I hear from a lot of people. Oh, you can't take those cars away from those Germans, right? But if you actually look at prevalence of how many companies actually provide autos, it is indeed going down. So somebody out there is taking cars away from Germans. So it's like, how do you operate?
I'm not taking cars away from Germans.
No.
Let's just make that announcement on this podcast.
Some people, Paul, but not
some
Tammi.
People that aren't Tammi.
Tammy's not in the Venn diagram of those people.
No, but it's like, companies aside, but I think you hear a lot of this, like, well, this is what the market does. And it's really hard sometimes to actually quantify that, right? Like, well, no, mathematically, there are somebody out there has decided to get rid of cars in Germany. I don't know who, right? But it definitely happens. But it's separating this like belief system or these, old practices from what's actually a current practice.
Even if you decide that you want to keep it, it's such a great example, Paul, because even if you decide you want to keep it to be competitive, right? So the numbers are going down, but that means we're an employer of choice and people want to come work with us. To go tell an American management team that we're going to get cars for everybody, and they've got the you get a car mode going. They're like, what is that? And then then Tammy's in the middle of that. Like, why are you giving cars to everybody in Germany? And having to explain that, because in the U.S. that concept is just such a large hurdle to get over out of the gate, especially when you get down to the fact that actually the last organization I was at, our dev team, part of it was in Berlin. So, when you go, and part was in not Berlin, right? In North America, if they're talking to each other, they're going to figure out like, hey, I don't get a car. Why does Paul get a car? We literally do the same job. We're in the same department. We're sharing this stuff. We're doing this work. And Paul, I'm going to leave and go get in the car I paid for. And Paul's going to go get in your car. Like, what's up with that?
Yep.
Yeah. Anyway, we're picking on the Germans again.
Well, but I think it's just all those benefits on like what's prevalent. What's prevalent is
that's not unique to Germany too, right? Like there's lots of countries that.
Oh, every country has their thing that it's like, wow, that is unique, right? And it's just a question of how do you manage that uniqueness? Like it's everywhere, right? Yeah. The statutory minimum increases in Belgium, the way they package salaries in India, do you communicate in monthly versus annual or weekly term? Like there's all these there's a big table waiting to be created about like how does this country think about it? And
well, but if you roll that all up, and I think kind of bring that all together, Paul, how do you then compare and say we want to pay we want to be somebody who pays at P70 globally? I don't know, pick something for these roles, right? That's you got to get all those different types of apples together to figure out what the cost of that bushel of apples is. And my makeup of Mac apples, Granny Smiths, and Gal apples is different to get to that bushel to figure out that it's pretty equitably, we're kind of where we want to be in each place. And again, it gets complicated fast in these global places.
And it's so important too, right? There's so many different levers that you can pull from a total rewards perspective, and you really have to make sure that you're looking across the gamut of what you provide before you make an adjustment to one of those levers. Like, oh, well, we're not quite as competitive as we want to be with this lever, not paying attention to the 3 other levers where you may be more competitive. I get this question a lot around retirement and base pay, right? It's particularly outside of the United States, where you could contribute more into their pension plan, but if you do that, are you being over competitive in the total package, right? So there's just all these levers that you have to make sure that you're looking at before you make a very narrow decision around one particular benefit that you may have fallen behind on because you're way more competitive in other areas. The red, yellow, green, right? Going through the red, yellow, green of your benefits.
Yeah.
I know a little cognizant of time, Paul. What is the best part was learning, but of all the functional, I don't know how to put it, the functional things, tactical things you do, what is kind of the hardest one you find globally?
Paul and I have kind of talked about this too. It's like staying competitive with pay range structure and trying to have a true global job framework, right? Because we say it doesn't matter where you sit in the world. If you're an engineer, you're an engineer, and we want to make sure you stay competitive, which sounds great. But then as markets move in different ways and as engineers may become more competitive to obtain in different areas, like how do you really maintain that structure on the go forward? Like you did it once, it looked great, and then you kind of get topsy-turvy. And so how do you make sure that you stay competitive in all the locations that you operate?
Yeah. And it's what makes it particularly hard is what might be true today might not be true tomorrow. Like engineers are an extraordinary premium in the US, India, and a few other places, right? Let's just go with that. That may not be true in a few years, right? AI, the robots take over, all of a sudden coding is cheap, right? And if you've built your structure assuming there's a difference, well, now how do you navigate that? Or the opposite can be true, right? Finance and HR people are largely synonymous at a given level. Pay rates aren't drastically. Wow, I made up a new word. Wow. Drastically or dramatically different. But that could change, right? What stops one of those functions from becoming more or less a premium in a given place? And now you've got to find a way to solve that. So it's not a set and forget kind of situation. Like you need to know, how will I maintain a global lens of work with local competitive pay, knowing that the markets will evolve, right? Something's going to change over the course of, some shelf life, 5-10 years for sure, but maybe even 1 or 2. And that's what makes it so complicated is what sounded great at implementation may not feel so great 2 years later because all of a sudden the environment changed on you.
I think what's interesting about that is if you're an American-based only business, being American, is you anecdotally can have a feel for when that change is happening because it's the country. Whereas if you start to get in multiple countries, back to the beginning, Tammi, your relationship, you can't have an anecdote. I think it's very difficult to have an anecdotal feel of the economy when you live in the U.S. of what's going on in Eastern Europe or somewhere else. And so those relationships, I think, become really important and trusted so that they can call you and feel like they're not whining. They're actually telling you we've had a different, things are changing here, not at the same rate. So kind of going back to that relationship piece, because I think it's impossible to not be a team. You got to be a team player in the global environment.
Yeah, absolutely. And Paul and I were talking about China, right? So, and it's really because we've changed our business model and our expectations in China. It's derived, right? It didn't start off that way, but as a new HR leader came in and we were building our relationship, he's like, here's some observations that I've had. And I'm not the comp expert, but I've had enough HR experience that there's something off. And so, we're digging into it to find out what it is, and it's kind of going, cattywampus in our program or in our structure. So, how do we how do we meet the needs of the local business and the experiences versus what you can't capture in market data.
Yeah, totally.
First of all, I have to appreciate that you used
Cattywampus.
Yeah, cattywampus, and Harvard MBA is going to want to use that. That's one of those. That's not usually in buzzword bingo, but that's my type of word, Tammy, and I really dig that. I'm glad we used that.
Yes, great.
It definitely tells a story.
It
Definitely
does.
tel's a story. I'm gonna
It's
ask.
a very good descriptor of what's happening, right?
Yeah, it is. People know what you're getting at when you
Yeah.
use a phrase like that. That's for sure. I'm going to ask one last sort of very tactical global question because I get this a lot from people who are taking on global roles. Like you mentioned, like one of the frustrations is just finding a time to work with people. So like, what's your recipe for global collaboration? Right, you're a night owl. So does that mean you skew one way? Like, what have you learned is the right way to collaborate globally, given that there is like 1 hour a day that most of the world is awake? So like, how have you navigated that?
So I would say that, finding a time for a large meeting, right? That's going to be a little bit different than a one-on-one. So large meetings, honestly, I try to do 11 o'clock Eastern, right? It's you get as close as you can with the world that, right? And you record for those that just can't get there.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. The Australians don't love that. And
The Australians
you
don't
record it
love
and move
that,
on. Yeah.
but I also have East Coast and West Coast in the U.S., right? Like, there's no good time, just record it. When it comes to one-on-ones, I try to actually do that in their local. So I have also learned that if you talk to them when the U.S. isn't awake, you get more of their attention. So, like in the UK, as much as I am not a morning person, I will get up and have a 6:30 a.m. call with UK, not on video. Right? But when it comes to China, we do most of our work at 8:30 at night Eastern time, because that's actually when I have the focus time to really hear what they're saying and be able to do that collaboration. That's when I am my best to have the conversations with them. So that's how and I kind of do the same thing with the West Coast, right? So I have a lot of my like project meetings, they start at 5 o'clock Eastern, because it's less noise for them, and I don't have to worry about interruptions myself either. So that's
I think
Tammy's
that's
world
I think
of
that's
how I
awesome.
interact with people.
No, that's great. Yeah.
I think it's awesome. I do a lot of 4 or 5 in the morning with China because I catch their day. I think especially when I'm the minority of people on a call, there is, and so you're helping fight this. You will see Europeans and Asians and everything else. They will bend over backwards to have it in the American time zone, and you're like, dude, there's like 4 of you or 8 of you, and there's just me. Like, I can move. And so I think that's awesome that, I think just being cognizant of each other and being humans goes a long ways. And I usually layer it out as like, you're going to have a tenuous call at some point. Like, that's going to happen. And so I think building that relationship so that you can actually have that call and be like, Paul and I've done a lot of work together. And then when I can call and be like, Paul can call me up and be like, Sean, that's the dumbest thing I've ever heard. And I can be like, I appreciate that, as opposed to have a knee-jerk reaction. But I think that's great, setting the times based on the group. And actually, I had not thought about it. I do it in the morning because that's my best brain. I didn't put it in those words. I think that's a great way to put it. I'm sharper there. You get me at 8 or 9 at night, like, that's a good time if you want something from me. Because I'd be like, whatever, I need to go. But I really like that idea of like, when's your focus time, and setting a focus time for people.
The only flip I'll put to that is sometimes it's just inconvenient for somebody all the time, right? Like, shout out to my old friend Shao Kan in China, that we just agreed we're going to make it inconvenient every other time, right? It's going to be late at night for me one time. It's going to be late at night for her the next time, because there really is no good time for ever to be like a permanent thing. And just being candid about that.
You still gain a ton of respect by the fact that you want to rotate it. Because you're right, outside the United States, they're so used to the U.S. being like, well, here's my time.
Yeah.
That they kind of, like, when I first proposed that to the new HR leader in China, he was like, are you sure? And I'm like, yes, I am sure. Like, you actually get a better part of me by being at this time. So yes, let's do it.
Which is ironic, because it flies in the face of, we never take vacation and think about work all the time, but we'll only work during our daytime. Right? Like, it's this weird, like, they have these two perceptions of us that kind of are counter to each other. But I think that's great. And I do think like all these ways are really kind of a takeaway for global teams doing anything is you just, if you treat each other like humans and be understanding, I think that's great, Paul. Like, hey, just admitting this is going to suck for somebody every week, we're just going to take turns, not having fun.
It's the only way to do it. Yeah.
And the value of teams. So this is kind of my last little anecdotal for someone who has a direct report that's international, right? I had an international direct report from China, started at the company in 2020. Obviously, we never saw each other in person ever. But with Teams, like you can do Teams through your phone. So we would do a Teams meeting on the phone, and then I would flip my camera around and show her like holiday decorations or something. Like it was really invaluable when we're talking about, I was like, oh, our Christmas lights. Okay, well, Christmas lights in the US are different than Christmas lights in China. So I literally walked around our neighborhood and showed her our lights. And then when it came to Lunar New Year, she did the same thing. She went out to her square and was showing me all the lanterns. And it was like, you felt like you knew each other at a different level, even though we never got to see each other in person.
Yeah, I think
How
using
culturally
it.
cool is that? So when someone says, well, they have Chinese New Year or Lunar Year, like that's crazy. And you're like, actually, it's the thing. Like it's amazing how cool it is, culturally to get to see that. Like that is super cool.
And using it as a learning opportunity, right? Like, hey, let's be curious together and walk around the neighborhood and see what happens, right?
Yeah.
Well, I want to be respectful of listeners' time and of your time too, Tammi. So thank you for all of the wisdom you've shared and for opening up a little bit about your career and experience. It's been super interesting and helpful. I hope you've enjoyed it as well.
Yeah, it was great working with you both. So thank you so much for inviting me.
Yes, thank you.
Thanks.